So it's so boring to say, ever since I was a little girl, I've loved writing. That's not true. What I've loved since I was a little girl was reading. To be able to escape to all these different worlds and to sort of really understand how other people thought. And obviously, the older that you get, the more you learn, the more you read, the more you have access to understanding about the world, lots of people obviously have had no choice but to sort of grow up with that understanding being pretty bloody obvious. I was moved up a year at school when I was 7 because of being very tall, insane, but there we go. And
wait, hang on, what? Do I call him a disabled person? Do I call him a person with disability? Do I call him a ginger person?
I prefer to be a person with ginger, actually.
Oh, non-alcoholic beer.
You're a grown-up. You can make your own fucking decisions.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm a useless waste of space and I'm not doing anything and not being productive. You're just like a little bundle of, uselessness on the sofa falling asleep next to the dog.
Welcome back to the Not Quite Pod. Today we've got Kat with us. Kat, do you just quickly want to introduce yourself and let everyone know a bit about yourself?
I do, but first of all, I want to say how exciting it is to be here and not least to be on a call with another redhead. This literally
very rare. It's very rare.
It is. I feel like we're sort of 20% of like the UK's redhead contingent in one space. This is mad. Hello, everybody. My name's Kat Brown. I'm a journalist and a writer and the owner of a particularly allergic dog and a really random cat. I'm the author of It's Not a Bloody Trend, Understanding Life as an ADHD Adult, which I basically made because I got so fed up seeing people in my industry using ADHD as a scapegoat and found that this was a very cyclical society thing, which I've seen done with trans people, depression, any kind of thing over the years. So I sort of wanted to make a support group and a book for people waiting for diagnosis or who've been recently diagnosed. And then my other book, which is my first book, but came out the month after the other one for very confusing reasons of publishing, is a collection of 22 pieces of writing about baby loss, miscarriage, not having children, changing your mind, which sounds really, really, really miserable and horrible. And to be fair, when you're going through that, which I did, and obviously everybody in this book did, doesn't actually feel like a barrel of laughs, but it can feel incredibly isolating. So I really wanted to have this sort of collection where we could just basically have all the violent, horrible, unbeautiful feelings that you're not really allowed to have. You have to sort of go away, feel them on your own, and then come out when you're finished and socially acceptable again. So yeah, support groups and a book are basically my raison d'etre at the minute. And it's really lovely to be here. Thank you for having me, Charlie.
It's okay. I'm absolutely buzzing for this conversation as well, because it's something I've always been concerned about, over the fact that it has felt a bit like the ADHD world's changed a lot recently. And then also it's a very no one knows what's okay, what's not okay. So it's really nice to speak to someone that's gone through it and properly looked into it and experiences it themselves. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to sort of diving into it. But first of all, I wanted to get a bit more of an understanding of where your love of writing comes from and where that journey started and what got you into journalism.
I've loved, it's so boring to say, ever since I was a little girl, I've loved writing. That's not true. What I've loved since I was a little girl was reading, because I grew up in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, and I didn't get a games console of any kind until I was about 11. I used to go over to my friend Annabelle's house and watch her play Zelda on the SNES. So my sort of escape was always books. Yeah. And I could read really, really fast. And so I just absorb myself in pretty much anything, really. Library books, just whatever I could have. And that just really got me escaping from, a fairly, totally fine, really nice, very pleasant, but, quite boring upbringing. To be able to escape to all these different worlds and to sort of really understand how other people thought, not necessarily in great variety of thought, because frankly, you didn't really in children's books of the period that I was reading. It wasn't like now when we have so much more breadth and depth of who's allowed to be an author and who's allowed to be a main character and that sort of thing. But stories just absolutely blew my mind. And around the same time, I got really into the Jaws films when I was about 7. Watched all of them, got completely hooked on them.
Wow, that's early.
Oh, I know. This is another classic 80s thing of going around to a friend's house after school and not really being observed as to what we were doing. But then my parents, again, for God knows what reason, it wouldn't happen today, but then there were like Ladybird adaptations of Dracula and Frankenstein with little cassettes telling you to turn the page. So I feel like the 80s just in general was a different place. But yeah, I got really into sharks and watched loads of documentaries. And weirdly, I think that was actually somehow where I started to get some understanding of how the world was unjust. Because to my understanding growing up, all of the injustice of the world was finished because, oh, well, that all happened 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And obviously, the older that you get, the more you learn, the more you read, the more you have access to understanding about the world, the more, well, lots of people obviously have had no choice but to sort of grow up with that understanding being pretty bloody obvious from early on. But I was just blissful in my little white middle-class ginger cloud. And yeah, so it was kind of mind-blowing growing up to actually discover that, oh my God, Kat, it's not just sharks at all. It's actually quite a lot of your fellow humans. But yeah, sharks are my gateway to social justice, if you like.
Well, I would not have seen that connection, so I'm quite grateful you pointed out that one. I'm like, actually, I can see how that would make sense.
Oh, sorry, I should explain that if you don't know that sharks have been used in the finning trade, so that they are, for a long time, people would catch sharks, cut their fins off and drop them back into the sea to use for, if you just think it's like sharks and their sort of profile on Jaws or something, that might be a bit random. But yeah, I think it was just using that as a gateway to the fact that humans can exploit their fellows and other creatures in the world quite a lot, beyond the measures of Blue Peter. Yeah, that was kind of mind-blowing to me as a reasonably small child who hadn't quite been indoctrinated into Blue Peter bringing buy sales yet.
I would completely agree. Like, that's the whole thing when we talk about disability in general, is that whole thing of even today, we are so marginalised and don't have the opportunities that others do. And as you say, it comes into that's just my lived experience with disability, but it comes into so many different facets. And as you say, the more you grow up, and particularly if you surround yourself with different people from different walks of life, you get pointed out different scenarios and you're like, shit, does that still exist? And they're like, yep, that still does exist. Still happens to me every day.
I really, thinking about this, one of the many reasons why I found some of the ways that older white women have basically been indoctrinated against trans people so troubling is because when I grew up, first of all in the suburbs of London, then later in the countryside. I didn't know anything about gay people or lesbians at all because of Section 28. And, we just weren't taught, not that you have to be taught about them in schools, but there was just no conversation about them at all. And the only conversation that really happened was people like Chris Moyles on Radio 1, not to obviously put all the blame on him, but culturally, using gay as an insult. And that obviously translated hugely to the playground. So when I did meet like my first gay, lesbian and bi friends at sixth form and upwards, which obviously I had met quite a lot of people by then who just weren't out, because why would you be in that sort of environment? I was just so ignorant, not in a sort of like, oh, I'm dissing you because you're gay, but I found being bisexual really confusing. Not that it wasn't anything for me to understand. But at sixth form, I was also at that stage where Queer as Folk was out on Channel 4. And actually, there was quite a lot of really good sex education on Channel 4 at that point. They had a really brilliant film about the Stonewall riots, which I remember watching when I was about 13. Eurotrash, obviously, was fabulous. And all of these programs that, again, now would look at them in the sort of same horrified way as you would the Ladybird versions of Dracula with their terrifying illustrations. You'd be like, this isn't for children. Eurotrash isn't for children. What on earth? And it's like, well, it was. And it was really bloody helpful if you were growing up in the middle of nowhere, not really understanding very much because all you had was what you happened to pick up in whatever book you read. I was weirdly very well informed on female genital mutilation due to one of the Alice Walker books that I got out of the library. And I think I was about 12 or 13. But again, it's so random as to what you pick up. And so I was just really, I'm just really conscious of that now. Not that I'm, an unignorant person. And there are lots of ways that I'm obviously still learning, still changing and will do throughout my life. But just to remember how damaging ignorance is, and particularly even more so when it is forced on people.
100%. And I think one interesting thread that I'm going to pull on that you mentioned is, but both of us for different reasons. You love stories because of the love of reading. Me being a dyslexic person, the idea of sitting down and reading is the worst thing possible. However, I love a story. So I'm that kid, stick me in a bar and I've somehow made 6 new friends because I'm intrigued by other people. So I love hearing other people's perspective, ideas, everything going on. So I naturally, the people that I surround myself with are from so many different walks of life. And because of that, I'm so much more, as you say, there's levels of ignorance that I still have, but I'm so much more socially aware of scenarios. And I'm like, no, that group does experience this issue and this does still happen. We still need to fix this, and it doesn't not exist just because you don't see it. And it's so powerful to surround yourself with the right people and the right information. Obviously, I'd imagine your friendship groups and the circles you move in are very similar, but that education started from reading books. Whereas for me, I think where I was the weird, disabled, loud kid in the room, I naturally saw bringing conversations together as part of the way of, this is the way that I can be accepted by everyone because I'm the chatty disabled guy, still maintaining that status today, running a podcast. But it's really interesting that that's been your view and how you viewed things and how you've then taken that on into your professional career as well.
Completely. I also am just hugely interested in people, but for years and years and years, I found actually talking to them really challenging unless I put on a character or a front, or for a very long time was drunk or about to get drunk, or in situations where there was, some level of booze to sort of remove that social anxiety. I really wanted to become a journalist, partly because I wanted to entertain people. I like writing humour and writing about things that I loved and sharing those sorts of things. But I was very shy without realising it because I didn't dress like I was shy. I loved colour and sort of embraced all of that. I'm also 6'1" and I'm a redhead, so there's a lot going on there. But I just found it really difficult dealing with people naturally, because I never knew naturally who I was. I was moved up a year at school when I was 7 because of being very tall, insane, but there we go. And
wait, hang on, what?
So in the 80s, growth hormones were quite a big thing. And when my parents, I think I was at a routine checkup or something, and they were like, she's really tall. And the doctors were like, well, okay, you could move her up a year because she's reasonably smart and nobody needs to know that much now. Or we could give her growth hormones to stop her growing and stunt her growth. And so there was no sort of just stay as you are. It was like either or. And on the one hand, if I hadn't been moved up a year, I wouldn't have met a lot of people who now I couldn't imagine not being in my life, not least my husband. That was a real sliding doors moment. Because also I didn't have a gap year after school, even though I was young, because I hadn't been diagnosed with anything at all yet. But my parents were just like, okay, if you leave, you'll never go back into any kind of education and you'll just slide somewhere. You need structure. So I got moved up a year, and it's completely mad because actually I was 7. And the thing is that they just assume that everything will be the same, but you have immediately lost like a year of being a person, of understanding how socializing works. And also like the rules of the playground. Oh my God, even if it's literally just like I don't know, games of bumper car with a skipping rope or something. There are all these little cliquey things, particularly because I was at a girls' school when I got moved up a year. I changed from my very nice little school up into a slightly more challenging girls' one. And that was just a whole load of codes that I didn't understand. And I think that just sort of was the trend through pretty much all of my school years until I got to sixth form, where everybody was just letting their freak flag, pardon me, fly, and other such cliches. But no, I was bullied fairly tediously all the way through school. And it was just, I didn't know about depression or anxiety until I started being treated for them because I was suicidal in my first year of university. And I didn't want to inconvenience anybody by being suicidal, which was the number one reason why I never acted on it. But that whole not wanting to inconvenience people really came about through the fact that I just felt as though my entire personality, my entire being was so not what people wanted, if you liked. And I didn't know what they did want. So I would try sometimes and be what I thought they wanted, and then that didn't work. And if I was just myself, then I was, sad or a loser or chanted at or all that sort of stuff. I actually ended up just beating up one of these horrible people in a fourth year drama class. Get that from middle class angst. And it was just something that absolutely just snapped. Yeah. And unfortunately, that whole thing about wanting to fix myself was just something that continued through my 20s and 30s because I just didn't know how to be or that I was allowed to be. And actually, I really love all of the things that I'm seeing now from, without wanting to sound 900 years old, from Gen Z and so people who are now in their 20s, I'm in my early 40s, and younger, about understanding how their brains work and their minds and wanting to work on acceptance more generally, because acceptance is something that I find so hard for myself, because my journey isn't ended up with, a nice bow. Yeah. And now that I know all of the reasons that I am how I am and the various issues and stuff that I have going on, I can't go back into the way that I was before, partly because I used alcohol quite a lot as a crutch. And I don't want to do that anymore. I've just passed 5 years sober, which I'm really happy with. Alcohol was fabulous, and then it stopped being fabulous for me, so that's fine. Had a lovely time with it, but definitely for the best that we just remain jolly good friends and never speak again. Not a problem for other people, obviously, but for me. And it's just been a lot, basically. Yeah. So I was really surprised that, having always thought and hoped that I would be an arts journalist, and having done that a lot, is actually that the work that I have done that has had the biggest impact on people has been either sharing my stories of when life has been really difficult or surprising, not to walk around like, hello, another glum message from me, but also just all of the things that I've been like learning across the way, because certainly when life's been really hard for me, I've just automatically reached 4 books, 4 podcasts, because I think as much as I loved stories, what I loved above all else was seeing how people were living their lives and negotiating all of the difficulties that entails, whether you are a 7-year-old in a fantasy novel or an adult in a poetry book.
I mean, I love that, because as well, that shows that like it's all about finding what works for you, but then also not only that, but it's what I always say, and it's an old sales cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway, of people buy into people. Like if people, most of the time, if you listen to a podcast, the reason you listen to a podcast is because you like the person that's presenting the podcast. So people buy into people. So that shows as well, probably the reason why the work you saw do better was because people were buying into you. They got to know you and they got to know your story. So people buy into that because they can then relate to that. And I think there's so much power in relation of like, actually, I thought I was the only weirdo that experienced that. Turns out I'm not. And that's great. And I think going back to your point of like, your friendship group and finding your people and finding that quite tricky. That's a journey that I've only recently gone on of like, now I've got so many friends that are so many, like, you look at my friendship group and you go, hang on, why are there so many different age ranges here? What's going on? But I love it because like you're able to gain completely different perspectives from people and you're going, this doesn't work. Like this, but it works in my head. And I'm like, that's, as long as it works for you, that's the best way to be. And I think, as I say, it's that whole thing of people, I think too much want to fit in this box. We always want to fit in this pretty little box and fit into society. Why? It's like, yeah.
I know that was probably a rhetorical question, but I do want to address that just because there are certainly times when I really want to fit into that box. And it's usually when I'm at my most low.
Yeah.
Because there's a reason that cats, for example, love boxes. It's because they're cozy and they make them feel safe. And it's just sort of like, oh, it's quite nice, just sort of melting liquid-like into a sort of like Amazon delivery box. And there you go, you've caught a cat. Congratulations. Or like my dog is all sort of curled up in her basket, every side of her touching the edges. There's something about boxes that can sometimes make you feel held when you don't trust yourself. And I think whenever I felt at my most energetic, well, healthy, capable, firing on all cylinders, like using all of my talents to the best of my ability, helping people, using like with purpose, connecting, all of those things, which, my God, is a knackering list just to listen to, then I don't need boxes because I'm operating perfectly fine on my own. But sometimes I think, particularly if I'm like none of those things and I'm really lacking in energy, which happens a reasonable amount, actually. I've been surprised over the last few years. I don't have long COVID, but I think it's just a connection of, I had a hip replacement that got infected a couple of years ago, and that really threw me off for, I'd like to say a few months, but basically like pretty much a full year, if not more. And my ADHD diagnosis, giving up drinking, which was great, but also meant that I gave up this huge coping strategy without realizing what I had. And then, just all the other bits of life as well, that can be really tiring. And then when I am feeling low, that can also mean that I, feel quite exposed. And then all of the stuff that I usually love, which is chatting to people on social media, posting absolute bollocks in my stories and that sort of thing, it all becomes, I feel hunted by it because I'm like, am I doing this right? I start second guessing things again. I start not feeling like me because I start second guessing how a person should be. And that is, again, when those boxes can feel quite tempting, because it's like, well, if I sort of emulate what a human being is doing this way, then, that'll make things easier for me. Yeah. But it doesn't. And it's actually, I was listening to one of your previous guests, Persia, I think it was, and the lovely advice that her dad gave her about, if you fix the insides, then the outsides will follow. And obviously, I have cyclical depression. Sorry, that's not an obvious thing, but I have cyclical depression. I keep forgetting about it and then it pops back up again. It's very tedious and it's comorbid with the ADHD. It's not caused by the ADHD. But I need to remember that actually sometimes I need to stop trying to be productive and, be a capitalist monster and that sort of thing. And just literally lie down under my heated blanket and have a nap next to the dog for a bit. And that can feel weirdly challenging in itself because we live in a society where whoever you are, you're not really allowed to stop ever.
I completely relate to that. So that last bit I relate to so much because it's a conversation me and my partner have all the time of, I'm notorious of like perpetual go, 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 go. And then the worst thing is, so one of my like escape things is playing video games.
Yes.
So I will sit down and I'll start playing a video game, and then my brain will start going, but really you should be editing that podcast. Really you should be putting these clips together. Really you should be speaking to this person. You should really be doing this. And then it's like, just shut up and let me be for 5 minutes. But then my brain just takes over and it's like, it's so frustrating, because one of the things I was going to mention because I was going to ask you about your sobriety journey, and one of the things I've realized about myself, which is something that the more I talk to people, the more they relate to it, but it's one of those sentences I say out loud, and every time I say it, it scares the crap out of me because I'm like, that sounds like I've got a drinking problem. Basically, one of the things I've realized about myself is the only time my brain is not 100 mile an hour is if I've had a drink or two. But then also the clarity I get from that is crazy because my brain is able to focus on one thing rather than 200 things. The way I describe the inside of my head using the video game analogy is, did you ever play or anyone listening, the Nintendo Wii, and you had the little characters that you built and they would run around the little home screen, and then if you walked into the edges they'd run away? That is the inside of my brain when it's running from one idea to the other. And that is where my thing with alcohol is, like, if I have one or two, then it quietens that down. But then I sit there and go, that's not healthy. That's not. And I was going to ask your journey with, how your journey began with going into sobriety and what that was like and what the decision was like. That's a really weird tangent, and I apologize.
I love a tangent.
So you're probably sitting there thinking, where the hell did Charlie get that connection from? But
Mate, I've got ADHD. That's literally the last thing I'm ever going to think. It's more going to be like, oh, that is an exciting question. I mean, in terms of having a drink or two to calm down your brain, that's amazing, because I think my relationship with drinking was either absolutely nothing at all or all of the drinks. Sometimes it might be like sometimes it might be one or two, but that would be reasonably rare.
Yeah.
Because once it was like Pringles, once you start, delicious, say more it.
That's me in terms of, like, I'm very much similar to yourself of, I can do the one, I can do the none, can't do the one, and I can do one. I say, well, it's more my brain kicks in and goes, oh, we could do that again. We could do that again. Let's do that. Yeah. And that's where I start thinking, then we're treading on the dangerous path.
So this was the thing. Oh, by the way, I'm not going to sit here and try and convert you to the ways of sobriety at all, by the way. This is just my experience. But it took me a bloody long time to give up drinking. Like, I'm not joking. It was about 10 years. So I gave up in August 2019. So I must have been 36, 37. But honestly, I'd been circling around that for the best part of 10 years. I remember, like, I bought the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, they call it the big book, and I had it on my Kindle unopened for years because I was so paranoid that somebody might look on my Kindle and see that I had it and then go, oh my God, monster, burn the witch, sort of thing, which is, again, just an illustration of the kind of paranoia and anxiety and everything that I just experienced pretty much on the daily. But also, I think one of the things that always stopped me doing it was that I had very much a clear idea in my head of what a problem drinker looked like. Spoiler, usually a middle-aged man, probably with a red nose, sitting on a park bench. I didn't think that I really knew anybody who had a problem with alcohol. I mean, I knew some people who were quite annoying and slappy when they got really drunk, but they never seemed that bothered about it.
Yeah.
And it never seemed to cause, it caused some people close to them a reasonable amount of problems. But again, I think the stereotype was so clearly delineated, a little bit like ADHD, I suppose, that concept of either Bart Simpson or a squirrel or the dog from Up. Like, those are the three types. Spoiler, they're not. And so when I did finally give up drinking, it was so less of a big dramatic crescendo and then, oh, well, I guess I'm in the Priory now. I didn't go to rehab. I didn't do anything like that. It was just really fairly gentle and more of a just sort of, oh, I guess that's enough now. Okay, I'm going to go and try some things to see if they'll help. And they did, which is brilliant. But again, as with stories, I mean, for me, it was so much about listening to other people talking about their stories and realizing that actually alcohol was so rarely mentioned, but brains were. There was this wonderful concept of the washing machine brain, which I really stuck to for the first 6 months or so that I wasn't drinking, because that whole thing of just having loads of stuff sloshing around in my head just absolutely rang so many bells. But I think it's really difficult if you give up drinking and you don't have something to replace it with. So there's that really nice saying that comes from the recovery community, which is the opposite of addiction is connection. And I didn't consider myself to be addicted to alcohol because everything that I knew about alcohol addiction came from TV and mostly seemed to take place in hospitals. And I was like, well, I've never been to a hospital, blah. But that whole thing about still the loneliness, the uncertainty about how I was, how I operated and everything, that really rang bells with me. God, so many bells. And yeah, just sort of finding connection in other people's stories. Again, podcasts, real life people sometimes, books. And then, of course, Zoom during lockdown, that all just really helped. And also just realizing that just because I hadn't become that park bench stereotype yet, it didn't necessarily mean that was never going to happen, or something else that, could still screw my life up. And I'd certainly done enough of that just because I was trying to run away from the person who I was rather than, looking at her and accepting her as the person that I was and was going to live with for the rest of my life, and not trying to constantly turn her inside out to try and find the right glove puppet to work for whichever environment I was in.
It's interesting as well, because I think so many people do. We mask ourselves based on the scenario we find ourselves in. So like people would act differently in a busy pub in comparison to at home with their significant other, parents, blah, blah, blah. And it's such a common thing, because I think particularly it's something I see, and you might see in the disability community, of like, oh no, that's masking is just something that autistic people do and neurodiverse people do. And it's like, no, we all do it. There's all different versions that we come to the party with. It's just some are more pronounced than others.
This is totally it. I've just been reading Miranda Hart's book, I've Not Been Totally Honest With You, which is about her decade plus of living with ME caused by undiagnosed Lyme disease. And within the very first pages, she's got this wonderful quote by a theologian called Friedrich Buchner, all about masking. And I think one of the things that people don't understand about ADHD, ASD, whatever, is so much of it is about common personality traits or the things that make us human. And so therefore, some of the things that help us, or some of the challenging and unhelpful things that we think help us, like masking, are really common to like all humans, basically. Yeah. It's not just it's not like the Jets and the Sharks. It's not like you have to be neurodivergent in order to mask. Like loads of people mask. It's having a work face, if you like, or a work email style. It's just having. My husband sometimes refers to it as cosplaying, as somebody else or a type of thing. It's those sorts of things.
It's like one of my ones is I default to. It is a good and a bad thing. I default to self-deprecation in terms of humor around my disability. That's like my default of like my instinct when I go into a room where people don't know me is let's make a self-deprecating joke about disability because then that breaks the elephant in the room. That is a tactic I've used and still use to this day to then make myself feel more comfortable of, right, I've destroyed that wall. Now we can actually have conversations. And it's still something I do to this day. And you sit there and you go, why? There's no need. But I suppose it's that one's a bit of a bad example because...
No, it's not. Because I think another way of looking at it is like comedians, like the best types of comedians punch up, obviously, and rather than punching down. But I think the danger of being somebody who is sharp and charismatic and entertaining, as you undoubtedly are, as is completely evident, is that you'll scare the shit out of people that meet you for the first time. So actually, by making yourself the butt of the joke from the off, you're taking some of the heat out. Yep. You're not intimidating people who may just not be as sharp as quick on their feet as you are. And I think actually, potentially, that's probably got far more of a lead than your being disabled. I mean, obviously not to say that that everybody you meet isn't going to be a total idiot who's ignorant.
Yeah.
But, there's a lot to be said. And it's why so often comedians who want to put an audience at rest will start taking the piss out of themselves, because then the audience is like, okay, they're not going to like pick on me or tell me my shirt or something like that.
I think a lot of the time, and I've said it before, a lot of the time that tactic is also used because I hate the sensation of everyone's like, you're in a wheelchair. Yes, we can say it. It's fine.
Oh my God. Yeah. I've never noticed. Yeah.
Yeah. And I hate that scenario. So I automatically go, look, I'm just going to crack a joke about it, because then you're going to realise that if you've got a weird ass question, I've heard most of them before, you crack on. We can get that out. They can get that out of the way in the first 5 minutes. But that is very much like my approach to my condition. And I know everyone doesn't have that approach, and always sometimes feels like, why do we always have to bow to other people's wishes? But I just like to get that awkward sensation out the way, because then as well you get to know the real person, because they're not like on guard the entire time and like, oh, can I say this? Can't I say this? I'm like, just say it. Like,
yeah. And actually, that's so good. If you've got something in your toolkit that you can then, that doesn't cause you any emotional energy to use, then that's such a brilliant way of like clearing the area, if you like. It's almost like throwing in like a little smoke bomb and just getting rid of all of the bad vibes and weird questions. And then it's like, right, we can carry on with people now. Brilliant.
yeah, 100%. And it's a tactic I use all the time. My friends are like, why do you always default to that? And I'm like, because so many people, I walk or roll into a room and everyone's like, can I say this? Can't I say this? What do I call him? Do I call him a disabled person? Do I call him a person with disability? Do I call him a ginger person? What do I, just call me Charlie. Charlie's fine.
I prefer to be a person with ginger, actually. Just to be clear.
Sprinkled in.
Yeah, exactly. Although fingers crossed, it hasn't gone grey yet, so that's pretty good for early 40s.
Apparently we don't tend to go grey. We go like an orange tinged grey, and everyone's really jealous about it. And I'm like,
I like that. I'm still hoping for sort of like Rogue from the X-Men streak in my dotage. That would be amazing.
That I remember there was a girl I went to school with. She had she was ginger, had a blonde random streak that she had. It was like a little party trick.
I love that. That was very big in the early 2000s.
But I wanted to just quickly come on to your book about ADHD and how that all came about. Obviously, I know yourself from reading your story and listening to you that you had quite a late diagnosis, around 37, if memory serves correctly. Like, what was the journey like from diagnosis to then going, right, I've spotted a problem that I want to write about. Let's do a book.
Well, funnily enough, I really didn't think that the book would be needed by the time it was published, because I just thought, oh, well, I mean, there's loads of ADHD books already. This is brilliant. And people seem to be understanding things a bit better. And, you know, that people won't still be banging on about ADHD being a trend or any other thing. And then trans people in sport has just been wanging on throughout the Olympics. And it's just all of these social parallels that keep on happening. I got diagnosed in 2020 in that summer. The year before, my husband and I had 2 cycles of IVF that didn't work. And that was sort of around the same time that I gave up drinking. So those were 2 fairly massive life changes, or, you know, understandings about myself within a fairly short period of time. And the following year in 2020, we'd looked at going to a private clinic to see if we could try again. And they were just like, yeah, this just isn't going to work for you. We just don't recommend it. So that was fucking harsh and a half. And particularly as that was in lockdown. So the only thing we could really do to cheer ourselves up was going for a desultory walk around Brockwell Park for an hour and making sure we were back in time. But I just I'd sort of looked a lot into adoption over the years. There are some brilliant podcasts, again, loads by queer parents as well, which I'd always chimed with more, not because I'm a special snowflake as the, you know, straight woman over here, but just their sort of experiences of navigating life and parenting felt like something that would work for me. And that weirdly made a bit more sense once I realised I was neurodivergent. And the stupid thing is that I just ended up seeing a Twitter thread about an ADHD coach for adults saying, if you were diagnosed with ADHD and as an adult, how did you know? And I just sort of clicked into this thread and then saw through men, women, he's, she's and theys, my entire life laid out in other people's stories. And I couldn't believe it. So I then did what a lot of people do, which is basically inhale Google. I read everything that I could find about it. And then just thought, oh my God, this explains everything. Because I've had this like clutch. I just felt so greedy I had an eating disorder, depression, anxiety, insomnia, and other things that I can't even flipping remember because my memory is appalling. That's probably one of them. And then went to my GP and delivered them my sort of little 10-minute TED talk of why I thought this was a thing. And they put me on the waiting list and said, oh, it'll probably be about a year. And at that time, I was like, oh, I really don't want to wait a year, partly because I'd just been on waiting lists for IVF, which was incredibly fortunate, and also for eating disorder treatment a few years previously. And I was just like, I'm just psychologically fed up of being on waiting lists, which is very spoiled. I mean, ironically, I was on a waiting list the next year anyway for my flipping hip replacement. But I just thought, oh, but I know an answer now. I know an answer. So I sort of raided my tax account as a freelancer because I'd impulsively quit my staff job the previous year after the IVF didn't work, which was a stupid decision, but also fairly typical of undiagnosed ADHD because my rationale was, oh, well, I don't need maternity leave anymore. So now I can finally go freelance. Woohoo. And then it turned out that I just decided to go and get diagnosed privately. But then when I was writing the book, and sorry, I will come back to your question about why we did, I got a call saying that I'd finally reached the top of the assessment list. And that was after 3 years, not one. And I just knew that if I'd still been, and I mean, 3 years is unfortunately nothing now. Yeah. But if I'd been waiting, I would have been waiting every day going, is it now? 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 What about now? Yeah. And doing that for 3 years, going private was absolutely not a brilliant decision in a lot of ways. Nothing about the treatment that I've got. They've been absolutely amazing, but it's fucking expensive. Yeah. And, I don't have access to all of the things that would make life easier, even though my life is, very privileged and very lucky. But frankly, I'm not earning buckets of cash. So there we go. But in terms of why I wanted to write the book, I wanted to write something that would be directly aimed at a largely British audience of people realizing that ADHD was a big part of their story. I wanted to write something that wouldn't patronize them, that wouldn't sort of like broad stroke all people with ADHD as having exactly the same experience, because that's absolutely not the thing. I wanted to interview loads of people from as wide a range of experiences and backgrounds as I possibly could, because again, anything to do with our brains is completely intersectional. It will have your experience of neurodivergence will depend completely on so many things: race, sexuality, gender, class. Did you have any problems growing up? What was your family relationship like? How do you go about the world? Disability more widely, all of those sorts of things. Everything just intersects. But also, crucially, I was so cross with my profession, journalism, for taking ADHD and making it a villain of the week and not a very well-researched one, which is why I gave it the title It's Not a Bloody Trend, partly so that people could theoretically have something to hold up and wave at family parties whenever somebody inevitably said something off the basis of what a columnist had said earlier that week or whatever, and just not researched, but also to give a really not a hugely deep, but a pretty thorough social and historical context for the fact that ADHD isn't a trend, but oh my God, in society, we absolutely have a trend for treating any kind of difference, whether it's being left-handed, having a learning disability, being trans, being black, being gay, just in absolutely insane, awful ways, and tearing those communities and people apart, or locking them away altogether. So I think just reminding people, even though it's really hard sometimes, that we need to engage our grown-up rational brains and pull out the facts, just as I would about sharks when I was a little girl, and be able to go, well, actually, and not in a sort of, well, actually, sort of like ADHD explaining way, but, you know, just in a, but that's not true.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also, I think what the world we live in needs to just, we need more compassion for people. Like, it's the whole debate of a lot of the time. I sit there and say to people, they might not agree with something, and I go, does it affect you? Like, let's say, for example, they don't understand why people would want to be known by different pronouns. My straight up answer to that is, right, okay, we can do a deep dive on the facts and why it's not really like your decision, and you should just, if someone asks you to, just do it. But then also I sit there, let's make this really simple. Does it affect you? No. Are you going to die? No. Just, if someone wants to be known by different pronouns, give them different pronouns. It's just, don't overcomplicate it. It really bugs me. I'm like, just let people be people. If they want slightly different, if they want to be known slightly differently, let them crack on.
My favourite counterpart for the pronouns discussion is saying, well, my married name is Mrs. Blah, and nobody's ever given a second look at that. And you've managed to pick that up pretty quickly. You actually think that's a pretty positive thing.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I actually swing between two names and two different little honorifics.
Yeah.
I mean, is that not greedy? Is that inconveniencing you? My friend Helen Zaltzman does an amazing podcast called The Illusionist, and I can't find what on earth I've got on my T-shirt, but it's basically, I've got a T-shirt that says that singular they has been around since essentially the 14th century, and nobody's bothered about that. We use you in a non-gendered way. Yeah. We use they in a non-gendered way all the time. Like if we're talking about a cousin, oh yeah, they're coming along to Christmas later. And in there, you're talking about a single person.
Yeah,
so I think it's, again, just some of these things where we go, look, not everything is as, you know, hammered down and crass as social media particularly is trying to make you think. And there are, you know, there are just lots of delicacies, which is nice. But again, I think society can just, and not to obviously shove us all in the same box, more widely, we see that this sort of weird groupthink is so common when people are feeling more widely threatened. And, you know, as lovely as it is to think COVID's gone away, I've just had my jab, and unfortunately, like the hospitals around where I live in South London have been really like massively impacted throughout the pandemic, like so many places. And it doesn't, like the UK at the moment does not feel like a luxury mega first world country. And there are huge divisions, as we saw with the riots this summer and more widely, and people want to pick a scapegoat. There's a really interesting concept called future shock, which was coined in the early 70s. And it's basically where things advance too fast for the human mind to keep up with. And like the amount of social and technological change that we've seen in the last 30, 40 years, it's freaking enormous. Yeah. And I mean, I still find it wild that when I was at my little thrusting girls' school, when I got moved up a year, that was barely 20, 25 years from when women still had to have, one, a husband, and two, that husband's permission for them to be able to get a mortgage or a credit card or something. Yeah. It's like we haven't been at the forefront of life for the last 50, 60 years. Things have just been changing and evolving, and it's totally all right for us to be like, whoa, things are happening a lot, things are happening quite fast, and I can't quite keep up with them. But I think it's also then having that understanding as to why we might automatically move to fear and distrust rather than curiosity, inquiry and openness.
A big example of that is what we're seeing with AI. Is you've got it very split in two camps at the moment of like, there's the tech heads like me that are like, oh my God, there's so many possibilities. It's like putting me in a kid in a sweet shop. And then you got the other camp like, oh my God, they're going to take over our jobs. We're going to be living with robots. We're going to be, and I'm like, it's as you say, it's just that whole thing of we've sort of sped through this AI steam train scenario. And it is like, even when I take a step back and understand why people are quite skeptical and wary of it, it is one of those things of, I think we've just moved too fast, too quickly, and we've got to allow people to catch up. It's like, you can't blame someone if they're not on board with it straight away, because everyone's got fear of the unknown. If you look at anything,
it's true.
The whole
and
thing,
it's also, we're in an area of technology now where there does need to be some monitoring, and the fact that we're only getting an online safety bill in 2025 after years,
it's crazy.
It's not just of the internet, but of social media. I mean, everybody that was sharing like bullshit scam emails about perfume at garages in 2005 is still operating and navigating social media without any guidance at all. So there are definitely areas in which artificial intelligence is incredibly valuable, both for just literally scanning text and seeing which is likely to be, fake or pulled out or stuff. And I mean, for me, I use an app called Goblin Tools a lot, which is brilliant use of AI. But then I am very much one of those people that is signing Society of Authors petitions against people using AI to feed, potentially creating books and everything off that. I mean, the fact that ITV is advertising for essentially an AI production executive for 95 grand to cannibalize their own programming to make others is disgraceful. But there are so many ways that AI is excellent and particularly useful to people who need more support, which, to be honest, could be anybody, but certainly anybody with an interesting brain that just needs bringing back. Yes, exactly. I mean, where would we be without Grammarly or Word or spell check or anything like that? But as with everything, it's just, is this real? Is this true? Is this necessary? They're just such valuable things to sort of think about, particularly when there are so many areas like X, Twitter particularly, which are trying to cause or trying to harness our negative feelings for the sake of engagement.
Yeah, and I think that's something I've banged on about a lot on here, about how it's always negativity sells, particularly when it comes to the industry and area I work in, disability. God, social media and disability. God, you would think that we're all just moaning minis half the time, and it's like, it's only because that's what the platforms push, is the negative content, and it's like I said to a friend the other day, you'll always see someone having a wheelchair user having a bad experience on a flight, but you'll never see them absolutely smash it out the park, have a great experience, great customer service, happy days. Those experiences, while admittedly should be happening more than they are happening, do happen. And I've posted them, and it goes nowhere. And more so for the social experiment of, this is case in point of people thrive on negativity. And I'm like, why? What? I do
actually have a partial answer for you. Again, I know that was rhetorical. I'm sorry to be the irritating person. I do kind of have an answer. So when you're training as a journalist, one of the first things that they teach you is about the idea of dog bites man. I mean, boring, standard. That happens all the time. That's what dogs do. I mean, they don't. Badly trained dogs and upset and scared dogs, etc. But still, but man bites dog. Whoa, that's a story. That's unusual. So, for example, a disabled person getting on a plane without their wheelchair being mangled, destroyed, or otherwise forgotten, ideally, that's not a story. That is what should be happening on the daily. And so when it doesn't, that's when people get up in arms, understandably, because, this is awful. Why can't people travel anywhere? Blah, 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 blah. Racism, for example, unfortunately, is still something that happens, every day. But if it's, I don't know, a mixed race member of the royal family who's, just come in and she's an interloper and she's telling all these, they must be lies. She must be lying about our beloved royal family. Then that is, that's man bites dog. And I mean, my God, the people that I've obviously just made up off the top of my head, they haven't even lived in the UK for a bloody long time.
Yeah.
And yet there are headlines about them every single week.
Yeah.
Because people love that stuff.
Yeah.
And it's not always... that also sort of ties into the healthcare aspect as well, because again, nobody likes to think, even though God bless our beloved country, but it has gone into the sinkers in recent years, that, you know, we're not a sort of thrusting country at the head of everything.
Yeah.
And so it would be much nicer to think that actually it's just a load of like worried well who are signing up for autism or ADHD diagnosis and causing such delays and lack of medication and all that sort of stuff, which is just not the case at all.
Yeah.
But it is a useful narrative to be pursued because it's one that then tickles the nerves of some people who don't like to think of people getting something that they haven't.
Yeah.
That ties into inner ableism, underdiagnosis, I feel all that too, but I've never had to bother getting diagnosed or anything. No, because it wasn't offered. And also because you probably masked so convincingly, or you had structures in place that you didn't even realize about. You had a secretary, you had a wife, all these people just sort of keeping you going, that you wouldn't even realise that you needed these things.
On that note, it's one area that I really want to get your perspective on. What's your opinion on self-diagnosis? We've seen a huge increase in the people self-diagnosing. What's your point of view on it?
Well, I don't really have a point of view. It's what we all do before we go to the GP about literally anything. You don't just randomly turn up to the GP and go, just wanted to see if you could psychically intuit if I'm unwell. That'd be brilliant. I mean, like, I've never, ever, ever booked an appointment at the doctor without going, I'm a bit worried about this mole. My hip keeps randomly dislocating. I don't know about anybody listening. Yeah. So that is an element of self-diagnosis from the start. And I think when people talk about self-diagnosis, I think it's more people being irritated by people on TikTok. And I'm sorry, that's a completely different issue. People will always be annoying on TikTok. Yeah. I mean, I'm bloody annoying on Instagram. That's not the same thing at all. But in terms of self-diagnosis, one of the few reasons for getting, very valid reasons for getting a concrete ADHD diagnosis is so that you can access medication. Yeah. Because that's the only way that you can get them, unless you want to do fairly stupid things that are also illegal. But, people do desperate things. But also you want to be diagnosed for self-validation, self-actualization, for understanding yourself, even though perhaps people in your life may not understand you or understand why it's so important. Yeah. So actually, when I was, again, researching the book, one of the biggest things that I took away from two of the people who wrote the NICE guidelines on ADHD in adults in 2008, Professor Philip Asherson and Professor Susan Young, the latter of whom also co-founded the first adult ADHD clinic in South London in the 90s. The three things there were medication, sure, therapy. This is very important. This is for acceptance, particularly in adults. Yep. It sounds very like wooey and, acceptance, blah, blah, blah. Nonsense. If you're being diagnosed with something that you never knew about and you potentially have got quite a lot of impact in different areas of your life, you need to go through that with somebody. And then once you've really sort of had a good go at that, then it's behavioural strategies, coaching. And actually you can access coaching for free, although, my God, not with no little superhuman effort, through the government's Access to Work scheme, which is a terrible named scheme, but which is for anybody that suspects that they have something like a disability of any kind. And interestingly, there, a diagnosis is not needed, although a hell of a lot of patience is required because it is red tape central. Yeah. I did it once and I have not had the will to do it again. But there are lots of things that you can access there if you are willing to embark on one of the most bureaucratic quests in human existence.
I have to say, having gone for a wheelchair, bear in mind, I am a physically disabled person with cerebral palsy. I've had it since I was 4 weeks old. Pretty blatant. it was a headache for me. So when you're talking of a neurodiversity, I'm like, oh, it's just gonna be a hellhole, and you're just gonna have to go through it. And it's good. But then again, I have to say, it's that classic thing of my only piece of advice, having worked in local government, it's not the person at the end of phone's fault. I know it's really hard to maintain a even voice, but please try. It's my only.
Actually, every single person that I spoke to on the phone was wonderful and really kind and lovely. It's just a terribly set up system, particularly if you're self-employed. I think if you are employed, you have to be in work to access to work, which is, again, ridiculous name. Then that will take some of the heat off because you have somebody to navigate it with you and for you.
Yeah.
But oh my God, when you're doing it on your own, Lord.
Yeah, it's not fun, and it's a very, very long and tedious process. Very, very long, very tedious. I mean, my journey was, I think we're now on 2 years ago, and I applied in the January, and I actually got my new wheelchair in the December, which I believe now is quite fast. Hearing the stories that I'm hearing now, but at the time, I was jumping up, well, metaphorically, jumping up and down. But another thing I wanted to speak to you about was your podcast, because I love the concept of your podcast. Where did that come from?
So my friend Helen O'Hara and I, because obviously I only have friends called Helen, decided to set up a podcast that we would dip in and out of as and when work allowed, which I know is very frowned upon in podcasting, but we have lives and we're not getting paid. So we set up a soft drinks podcast to highlight really good non-alcoholic drinks because, my God, we've all seen crappy drinks menus through the years, and we called it pop culture. Yep. So we've interviewed sommeliers of non-alcoholic drinks menus at places like the Fat Duck, people who founded drinks brands, like lovely Ben Branson of Seedlip, and Laura Willoughby, who runs Club Soda, which is this amazing non-alc bar in Drury Lane in central London. Super, super cool. Oh my God. The amount of clinking bags that you come out with is incredible. But also thinking about earlier when you mentioned alcohol calming your brain, one of the things that has been so fascinating is the changes in functional drinks, by which we mean drinks that still have an effect on your brain but use no alcohol whatsoever. And one of my favourite people who I've spoken to for the podcast is Professor David Nutt, who was booted out of the government's drug advice panel in 2010, basically for saying things that they didn't particularly want to be public. I think it was something about ecstasy being less harmful than alcohol, which is
true.
Pretty true.
Yeah.
So he had been working on a drink called Sentia, which you can use as a base in cocktails and that sort of thing. But the whole idea about Sentia is that it gives you like a 2 wines buzz, but then it disappears and you can go off and take the tube.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I went and I've since had it at home along with another beautiful drink called 3 Spirit. They do one called a Nightcap, which is their sort of whiskey alternative. It doesn't taste anything like whiskey, but it is so like the mouthfeel and the gorgeousness of it. It's just something you just want to sit there whirling around in a glass. Again, sobriety is different for lots and lots of people. I don't drink these things that often, but then for me, I also don't give a second thought to non-alcoholic beer, for example. I really enjoy non-alcoholic beer, but there are some things that have a little bit of the Jaws theme tune about them, even though they might be non-alcoholic versions. So again, I don't have functional drinks or anything that often because I now sort of don't need them almost. But it's just nice to be able to have, along with drinks with CBD in or something. Yeah. But ideally, it's just we want drinks that taste of something, please God.
Yeah.
And the fact that there are even now fruity sparkling waters that actually taste amazing. Feel Good is a brilliant brand. They do ones that are really, really delicious for when you're weaning yourself off Diet Coke. Not that obviously everybody is weaning themselves off Diet Coke, but I have a tendency to just potentially overuse fucking anything. Yeah. So I did.
I relate to that. I relate to that. I relate to that so much. Of like, I find something I like and I'm like, I want all of it all the time, every day. And then I sit there and go, that's getting expensive. I need to stop doing that. But it's an interesting thing because I come from, and I've spoken about it before. We've had an alcohol specialist come on the pod, and I've spoken about the fact that non-alcoholic, particularly non-alcoholic beers and alcohols, or non-alcohol. That's what I'm going to call it. They get a bad rap, and I think it's hard as well because I come from a very drinking is very much part of my family culture. It's very much like if you turn up and say, "Oh, I'm not drinking," and your response isn't, "I'm driving," you get looked at like the weirdo. Now, but there is something to be said of like, everyone goes, "Oh, why would you want to drink non-alcoholic beer?" Or the other one that you get all the time is, "Why would you want decaf coffee?" And I'm like, particularly with the beer one's probably a better example, is you still feel included in the social side of things because you're not stood there holding a bottle of Coke. And I always say, like, it's always my default of like, there's only so much Coke you can drink. And what I loved about your pod is it really highlighted that there are so many great alternatives out there, especially when it comes to like, that's a lot of the time why people struggle when they're out and about and not drinking, is because the choices for non-alcoholic drinks are awful. They are terrible. Like there's normally like one or two options, or you might be lucky. There might be like, it depends where you go, but they are just, it's so hard to find one. And I think that's where the power of these more specialist non-alcoholic or soft drinks has a really big power, because it means that you can experience something a little bit different, because a lot of the time that's what we want. We want to go out and we want to do something or try something that's different. Like, I'm one of those people that if I go to a restaurant, I'm ordering the weirdest thing on the menu because I'm out and about and I'm not at home, so I want to try something weird. Same thing when it comes to, I've never tried one of those drinks before, I want to try one of those. It's a weird concept, but I think I'm so glad it's getting more and more popular and more talked about, to be honest.
It is. And I mean, the thing is it's not just in London. I mean, I kind of find it amazing now that I can go to a pub in the middle of absolutely fucking nowhere and know that I will be able to have a choice of at least 2 non-alcoholic beers, because for me also, it's not just about wanting to feel included. It's wanting to drink something that isn't essentially a drink that you could offer to a 5-year-old. I want to drink something that's got really good depth of flavour to it and tastes interesting. I mean, I may not drink 12 of them like I would have done when I was boozing it up, but I want to be able to have something that is interesting and tastes more adult, which again, I never really got into beer when I was drinking, because I preferred like cocktails and fizzy drinks and that sort of thing, or fizzy booze and whatnot. But I really love non-alcoholic beers now, and I love that I can drink them and not worry about anything that's going to happen from them. I don't get the more. The sort of like the nervous craving that I might have done. And actually, also, I found that it's so interesting. Like, there are loads of people that I don't mind drinking around at all, as in me not drinking, and they won't give it a second thought. And I've just realised that actually it turns out that I knew lots of people that didn't have problems with alcohol. I was basically the only one who was like a sort of nervous, like more drinker. And it was just like, oh, okay, fine. So just pretty much nobody, it's just not been an issue, because it's not been an issue for me, which is amazing. Plus also I'm incredibly blunt, and I think I once had a barman like joshing me about why I was drinking something. So I just turned to him brightly and just went, well, I'm an alcoholic, so it would be a disaster if I did drink one of these drinks that you were adding.
I suppose that shuts him up very quickly.
Oh, he looked fucking horrified. Exactly.
Love that.
So, I mean, I know that's a mean thing to do, but sometimes you've just got to kill them with kindness.
Yeah.
So that's not necessarily the best riposte, given that actually just choosing a nice drink and getting on with your evening is pretty much the aim.
I think it's hard. In that situation, you do sit there and go, it comes back to exactly what I said earlier. Just let people be people. Just let them crack on. If they want a non-alcoholic beer, let them have the non-alcoholic. It did not hurt you. This is what I will keep saying, is it has no impact on you. Move on.
Sometimes though, it does impact on people. And so one of the reasons that I do this podcast with Helen is she's always been teetotal.
Yeah.
She's not an alcoholic. She's never had a problem with alcohol. She's never had any interest in alcohol. And to which I'm like, how? What is this? How? What? No, amazing. But loads of people over the years have had a problem with Helen not drinking. Fingers crossed, not me, but still, like people trying to persuade her to have something, sneaking stuff into her drinks. And it's just like, God, it's so much more about them than it is about the person. Yeah. But that doesn't make it any better. It's just like, I sort of sometimes we need to have like a version of just like a cat would just occasionally swat you with its paw and hiss at you. And I suppose that's what, saying something short and sharp does. But I think there are still a lot of people who take it as a personal insult or a personal judgment on them that you're just choosing not to drink. I think or as though you're like raining on their parade.
One of the biggest things I've realised is because I've had this conversation quite a bit around surrounding alcohol, is it's such a big part of particularly English culture.
Oh yeah.
If you don't drink, you're a complete psychopath is the way that the UK population sees most people. But it's so, like, as I say, it's when one of my friends was like, why is it everyone's way of having a good time is going to a bar? And I was like, yeah, you're right. There are so many other things you could do. Like, there's nothing stopping you going and doing something weird and wonderful that you've never done before. But every Brit's default is, you go in the pub on Friday? Yeah, sure. And that is literally always our default. And it's so strange because I think, I don't know. I haven't drawn the comparisons completely, but even the American culture isn't the same. There's just something about us Brits.
There's a really interesting term that I feel like I'd only heard since we started having news reports about how we were losing them on third spaces. So places like bars, pubs, coffee shops, libraries, places where people can just go and hang out for prolonged periods of time and socialise that aren't at work or at home. And we've lost a lot of those since the pandemic because so many have shut down, either through people, going out less or just being a bit nervous or just, entirely things changing in the terms of how we socialise. But pubs have always been a massive third space for particularly English people. And I think it's important that we sort of highlight that because whenever people talk about Brits abroad who are like causing chaos, let's be real, it's usually English people, although pubs obviously still hugely popular with everybody else in the UK as well. But also it's just that it's the lowering of the social anxiety. It is, alcohol is that lovely, warm, social, cozy sort of oil, the social lubricant, as people have always referred to it. But the problem is that, it is quite difficult to moderate, particularly when you're in, when you're out with the lads, even if, the lads may be any gender. Just that sort of like pressure to keep going. And I mean, I'm sorry, nobody has like a glass of water for every boozy drink that they're having because it's just, you get distracted and you're having a lovely chat and you're finally warming up to somebody who you've never spoken of before. And I mean, and that is great in a way. It's the reason why so many lifelong romances are made at university because, lots of people are drinking.
Very drunk at that point.
Yes, exactly.
It's so true. And I think one thing that was interesting that came from my conversation with William Porter is there's actually a science that tells us why we always go for the second drink. It's actually proven as to why we do it. Because, and I might be butchering this, so I will also implore you to go and listen to our episode. But essentially, it's because alcohol has two effects on us. At one point, it's providing us with a stimulus, so we're like high energy, want to do stuff. The next part of it is we're being subdued. So it's the constant battle between subdued and I can't think of the word. And stimulated. That's the word. I was like, what is the word? And then also there's this other bit where if you wait for a while after you drink, you'll then start feeling that bit of low mood, oh, I don't like this. And what your body does is your body goes, oh, I know how to, particularly those that have been drinking for a considerable amount of time, they go, oh, I know how to fix this. Have another drink. And that's how the cycle flicks between. And it's like, it was really interesting for him to highlight. That's why. It's because you're going from a state of high energy, low energy, high energy, low energy, high energy, low energy. And it was, as I said, just found it fascinating. But there you go. That's why a lot of the time you go for the second drink.
That's one of the things about when you give up drinking, one of the sayings is just like, just don't have that first drink, because exactly, it's moreish, which is, great, but there are lots of ways that we use all kinds of substances and things and activities to try and dull the essential pain that can come with just being a human in the world.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Actually, I didn't ask. This is one question I really want to ask. What's been your favourite soft drink you've tried?
I loved Sentia. I think that was absolutely amazing. I also, oh my God, Bativo is another one. So that is a sort of spirit that you can, I mean, obviously it's not like an alcoholic spirit, but it's just yeah, lovely. And you can lengthen it and make it into something else, just a different, longer drink entirely. But it's that unfortunately is very moreish, and it is also 29 quid a bottle. And I'm just there, just sort of like, it's just such a weird, it's not aniseedy, it's not purely cider vinegary, but it's got those lovely, sharp, delicious, jagged, weird flavors that you just want from something in a glass with ice in it. That is absolutely amazing. It's so, so, so delicious. Shrubs are also another one. Those are fermented drinks, again, often based on apple cider vinegar. I was a big red wine, and I'd love to say champagne. In this economy, no. But like carver drinker. Yeah. And so those sort of sharper flavors are just absolutely amazing. But Helen and I went for an extremely swanky lunch at the Fat Duck to interview their sommelier there about their non-alcoholic menu. And my God, the non-alcoholic drinks pairing just knocked our freaking socks off. Like Helen has a different palate to me because she never got into alcohol. So she is genuinely very happy with Schlur, which always makes me feel like a total snobby bitch, because I'm just like, please try this. And she's like, I don't like it. Stop it. Stop making me drink the drink. But she loved everything there because they'd just thought about balance and depth and complexity and joy. Yeah. And I think that's the thing. It's like, whether it's food or drink, joy just has to be a part of it, because you're probably sharing it with one, if not more, people that you love, or at least can stand to be in the presence of. And it's literally breaking bread with people. It's that, the opposite of addiction is, I've completely forgotten what it was. Connection. Yes, that's it. What is it again? Please tell me. I need to go and get some of it.
But I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's because I've never actually heard of it summarized like that, of like just wanting something that is an adult drink that isn't alcohol. And I'd love the fact that places like that, obviously Fat Duck is very swanky. It's a restaurant I'd love to go to, but it's nice to see that they're actually going, actually, we want non-drinkers to have the same experience that people who do drink have.
But they've had that on the menu for like well over 10 years. There have been loads of places doing not just really beautiful non-alcoholic drinks, because I mean, people have always needed to drive. Obviously, if you're going to a posh restaurant, then to be honest, if you're in your 50s, 60s and upwards, very unlikely you're going to get the train. And actually, when me and friends have gone in the past, we very much did get the train, and when we were paying on our own dollar. But it's also, again, just having something that feels reliable and that you can look forward to, rather than, I mean, water is great, but it's also, it can be one of the more tedious drinks. I've actually just bought a recyclable water filter to try and make it more drinkable, and enjoying it a lot more now that I've got one of those. But again, just having that thing when you open a fridge and you see something and are like, oh, I'm looking forward to that. Oh, that's a treat. Yeah. And and having something in a special glass that is lovely.
Yeah.
Drinking, oh my God, I'm such a tramp, but I love drinking beers out of bottles. It's like drinking Coke out of the bottle.
No,
It just feels like a holiday.
Yeah, I literally, the amount of shite I get from friends and family about that, like, if I'm particularly with non-alcoholic beers, it feels so much more of a treat if it's in a bottle. I don't know why.
Yeah. But also, it's like, you're a grown-up. You can make your own fucking decisions.
Yeah.
Don't be babied by your family and friends.
Oh, it's when it's my mother. I'm like, she's like, "Oh, were you raised in the gutter?" And I'm like, it's a bottle.
Oh yeah. In that case, definitely put it in the glass. But more just sort of like on the choosing not to drink or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, it's all right. I'm not going to suddenly. It's not like I've just put. It's not like I've just set fire to a bouncy castle. The party atmosphere is not going to disappear because I've got like a non-alcoholic Peroni. But also there's a really brilliant British brewery called Big Drop who only do non-alcoholic beers. They do an amazing IPA called Pine Trail. Ooh. And they've just got, they're the shit, basically. They've won so many awards. My husband found them during lockdown because to keep me company, he very sweetly went on like a task to basically try pretty much every single non-alcoholic beer available in the UK.
I love that. I love that.
That was brilliant.
That's so cool.
That was a really good summer. And he has actually settled very much on non-alcoholic Guinness as one of his faves.
Everyone's favourite seems to be non-alcoholic Guinness.
I couldn't imagine anything more disgusting, frankly, than anything associated with Guinness, but I'm delighted for the people that love it. That's fab.
I mean, I always say this to people, I should like it because I come from an Irish background and I can manage it, maybe a Guinness and black, but yeah, everyone raves about the zeros. And we did an event at Twickenham and it was sponsored by Guinness. So we had a Guinness and black in the zeros, and that sounds like the strangest thing. Do you know what? I could deal with it. The worst thing with Guinness is it feels like an entire dessert in a cup because it's so heavy.
Yeah,
and everyone raves about Guinness, and even the other day, bear in mind, my dad is one of those people that's like, oh, non-alcoholic beer. He did the Guinness test. You know, the one where they say, try the real one, try the fake one, try the zero one. And he couldn't tell the difference.
This is the thing, though, and this is the thing that makes real change, is by having like the 0% ones at places like Twickenham, so that people who are driving or perhaps are there with their kids or just for whatever reason don't want to get as beered up as everybody else. It's when you know that what you're getting is as delicious and as good as the alcoholic version. Yeah. And that's absolutely not the same with all the beers. I mean, the San Miguel 0% is fucking thin as.
Oh, I can get on with that. I can manage the San Miguel.
Oh, he's got tastes, ladies and gentlemen. He's got thoughts, he's got notions. But like the non-alc Peroni is great. The non-alc San Miguel is, you know, fairly decent. Weirdly, the Beck's Blue is like, and the Heineken, which both would have destroyed me in the alcoholic forms, markedly improved by being non-alcoholic. And so it just, I think as long as people think that you're drinking something on a par to them, then that weirdly seems to take a lot of the heat out of the situation. Whereas if you're standing there with like a lemonade, they're like, you're not, what are you doing? You judging me?
Yeah.
Like, no, I'm drinking a lemonade. But sure, okay.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like the whole thing. Like I've seen it before in pubs where people will take off the label of a beer bottle so that people don't know that they're drinking non-alcoholic beer. And I'm like, it's not that deep. It's really not that deep. You don't have to worry about it. It's fine. But as I say, I do love the fact that it's slowly getting better. I mean, I was going to say to you, even today I was reading an article that Tom Holland released his own zero alcohol beer.
Good lad.
Yeah. He went teetotal for, I think he's up to a year now. And yeah, he was like, do you know what? I wanted to create my own beer, so I went and did it. And I was like, fair enough. Fair play. But I'm just glad that we're moving to, as they're giving people the option. As you say, we're slowly getting to the point where if you want to drink, the drink's there. If you don't want to drink, the drink's also there. So
yeah, and the options are good.
But lastly, I want to ask you the question that I ask every guest, which is what's one piece of politically correctness that you really strongly agree with or disagree with?
I have a real struggle with political correctness because I really associate it with awful newspaper opinion pieces from when I was like a teenager. And they'd always wang on about people being politically correct. And I still, it's like it's transferred to the words snowflake and woke. And it annoys me in itself that they always get the origins of woke so wrong. So I don't really have a sense of humour about political correctness because I just find it so fucking annoying and disingenuous and stupid and essentially just usually an excuse to have an inexcusable opinion disguised as, oh, we're just teasing the young. We're just, they've got no sense of humour, la, 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 la. So actually, I have usually a sense of humour about most things, and I've had to, because for a long time, I would be the self-proclaimed feminist, as they introduced me to, that would be rung up to go on to Nick Ferrari's show on LBC and be the voice of reasonable feminism. And that's absolutely, that is what it is. And that was good training for many other things, particularly around ADHD. But I think I just find it still so silly, probably because we've seen these cycles move from political correctness to the woke agenda or whatever total bollocks is being peddled by a columnist that day. From the gay panic to the trans panic and, oh, people are gaying our kids, people are transing our kids, that sort of thing. I think it's mostly just I don't have a sense of humour about cycles anymore. Yeah. That this idea that there is nothing new under the sun. At the same time, I'm completely incapable of applying that to myself because if I have a low energy day because I don't know, I did a really big trip or something the day before, then I will be incredibly depressed all that day. I won't be able to enjoy resting and thinking, oh, well, I'm going to work tomorrow or do something. I'll just be like, oh my God, I'm a useless waste of space and I'm not doing anything and I'm not being productive. And it's like, well, you couldn't be productive anyway because look at you. You're just like a little bundle of uselessness on the sofa falling asleep next to the dog. So I can't see that in myself, even though I've spent a reasonably long period of my life trying to see that. But I can see that in other things and other areas. And, maybe one day I'll be able to be like, oh, well, I guess we're just having a duvet day today then. Yeah. I mean, to the extent I still cannot watch daytime TV because it feels like I'm slacking in some way. It's like, I feel like I've wasted years of potential addiction to Loose Women in This Morning because I'm like, no, I can't watch that because somebody will know. And it's like, who on earth is going to know? The dog is asleep. Just, relax. But yeah, those unfortunately are just don't even have a sense of humour about them. I just find it wildly irritating.
No, and I do. I think it's because obviously my brand was all built on being not quite politically correct, and that all came from when I say that, that all came from the fact that I wanted disability to be spoken about in a fun, friendly way in the term of people shouldn't be fearful of it, because that was always my big worry. It's like, as we explained at the beginning of the episode, I would always feel the tension in the room because suddenly a ginger kid in a wheelchair rocks up and everyone's got to be on their guard and be politically correct. I'm like, come on. Like, it's none of it I've not heard before. Also, my belief is always the same of, look, I'd rather you use the terminology or the word that you want to use. We deal with the problem after the fact. No, and I don't make you feel uncomfortable. I just explain this is why we don't use that term anymore, and this one's probably a better one. Meanwhile, do you want another non-alcoholic Guinness? Here you go. And I think it's as we say, as I've said several times throughout this pod, it's just giving people the benefit of the doubt and allowing yourself to learn. Because that's my big thing when we open the debate of like, oh, but like I was born in 1954, I should be able to say this. No, just learn, you dumb. Yeah, it's just like you can still teach an old dog new tricks. That's the way you always remember.
And actually, thinking of that, like I'm really moved by the fact that America essentially changed its entire social viewpoint around gay marriage thanks to the sitcom Will and Grace, because that was when they were having gay characters in their houses on a very regular basis being normal but funny and lovely and varied and completely individual and completely over the top, just like, you know, regular people in sitcoms. Not usually regular people there. And similarly with disabled rep. Again, Heidi, completely forgotten her surname, but the showrunner of Call the Midwife, has introduced lots of actors with Down syndrome, because she has family members with Downs, and so it's really important to her that she increases that rep and also brings that understanding and also that work to young actors. And even I've been live blogging strictly for the Telegraph this year, and just the introduction of disability rep in the celebrities who are cast over the years, that again makes such a massive difference. That sort of soft power, if you like, about somebody having like a deaf contestant in their sitting room every week when they may never have met a deaf person in real life, or, you know, having gay couples dancing, lesbian couples dancing, just that whole thing about like then people who may not or think that they may not. Yeah, totally that. It's just absolutely massive. And I think that is something that makes just the world of difference to how people go about the world. Because even if they don't, I mean, just as that thing, you can't be what you don't see. You can't understand what you don't see. And I think it's really telling that we're seeing in the younger generations, particularly, the huge popularity of shows like Heartstopper on Netflix, that are again bringing all kinds of really like lovely forms of queer joy, with lots of other intersections along the way, to households that might not otherwise know about it, might not otherwise know that they need it until later on. But even so, are just, you know, learning and being part of the world. That is so important.
I mean, you hit the nail on the head of something else I was saying when we talk about disability and that whole thing of people walking in the room and not knowing how to react. Is I always say to some people where they're like, why are you so chill about it? And I'm like, because people only know what they know. You can't judge someone because they've not been surrounded by it or not been taught it. Because I know for a fact, if I didn't rock up at 25 years ago, my mum, dad, sister, they'd all be flipping clueless. Because it's just, you grow up with it, you kind of go, oh, this is how this works now. And you move on. And that's what I always try and give people the benefit of the doubt of, like, look, I'm not mad at you for not knowing what cerebral palsy is, because unless you knew someone with cerebral palsy, you're not going to know what cerebral palsy is. So here I am. Your education is here.
The in-house educator. Yeah, that's it.
The not quite politically correct educator. Maybe that's even a new handle that I'll start taking on.
But that's it. And actually, I love the concept of not quite politically correct, because that's just being a person.
Yeah.
That's as soon as we stop being worried and instead ask somebody what they like to be called, whether they'd like to be referred to by a nickname or by their full name, you know, how they sort of like to operate, what they're interested in, then they stop just being a thing or a concern or, you know, Bruce over there and become somebody who's real to us.
100%.
And that's, again, that thing about listening to the similarities, not the differences, listening to a variety of people's stories. It's epic.
And one of the things I always get, and not to blow my own trumpet, but I always get people going like, you've managed to show me so much, but then made it fun at the same time, in terms of, like, I'll start talking about disability, but because I always enroll that into anecdotal stories and funny stories, everyone doesn't realize they're learning as they're going along. They're like, oh wait, I never realized that was how that disability works. I'm like, yeah, that is how that works. And I think that's the thing, is like, then you're able to show the connections and the human side of, like, no, you all go through this. It's like the old thing that I always say as well. Is like, you've got a 95% chance of ending up like me, i.e. guy in wheelchair or person in wheelchair, than I have of having a eureka moment, turning into Usain Bolt and doing 100 meters in 8 seconds. There's a much higher chance of you turning to me. So that's where I go. The society needs to catch up with looking after disabled people, becoming more inclusive. But that's a very weird transition. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on. It's been amazing to chat to you, and I've learned so much, and I love, particularly, I'm definitely going to be picking your brains about the non-alcoholic drinks you've done. I definitely want some links to try these different ones, so I'll definitely be reaching out to you. But of course, as we always do with our guests, I'll link all of Kat's details below, so that if you do want to reach out to her, catch up with her, ask her a question, or just follow her, you can check out below, and we'll leave everything below.
Charlie, thank you so much for having me today. This has been absolutely epic. I've loved it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Not Quite Podcast. Please make sure you follow us on TikTok and Instagram to get regular updates about the podcast.
These my dollars, make it hurt.